In 1929, inside the dusty back rooms of a palace in Istanbul, a group of museum workers stumbled onto something that would send shockwaves through the entire world of cartography. They were sorting through piles of forgotten manuscripts and rolled-up documents inside the Topkapi Palace, the ancient seat of the Ottoman Empire that had just been converted into a museum. Nobody was expecting to find anything remarkable. This was grunt work, cataloging old papers so tourists could walk through the halls. But when a German theologian named Gustav Deissmann unrolled a piece of gazelle skin parchment roughly the size of a coffee table, everything changed. Painted across it in vivid color was a map dated 1513, covered in handwritten notes in Ottoman Turkish, decorated with illustrations of ships and strange creatures. It showed the coastlines of Europe and Africa on one side and the coast of South America on the other, drawn with an accuracy that made no sense for a map that old. But the truly disturbing part was at the bottom.
Stretching southward, curving east in a long sweep, was what appeared to be a landmass that would not be officially discovered by anyone on Earth for another 300 years. And that is where the real story begins.
The map was created by a man named Piri Reis, and if you have never heard that name before, you are about to find out why it matters. Piri Reis was not some quiet scholar sitting in a library copying old charts. He was a pirate, a naval commander, a man who had spent his entire life at war on the Mediterranean Sea during one of the most dangerous periods in maritime history. His full name was Haji Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, born around 1470 in Gallipoli, an Ottoman naval port perched on the edge of the Dardanelles. His father was a man of faith who had made the pilgrimage to Mecca, but it was not his father who shaped his destiny. It was his uncle, Kemal Reis, one of the most feared corsairs in the entire Mediterranean. From the time Piri was barely a teenager, he sailed with his uncle, raiding Spanish, Genoese, and Venetian ships under the loose protection of the Ottoman government. Both Christian and Muslim states relied on privateers to project power at sea, and Kemal Reis was exceptional at it. For over a decade, the two of them cut through the Mediterranean together, capturing enemy vessels, seizing cargo, and collecting something that would turn out to be more valuable than gold: maps. Every ship they boarded, every sailor they captured, every port they raided, Piri was watching, sketching, and taking notes. He was building a personal archive of navigational knowledge that no single person in the Ottoman Empire could match. And then, in 1501, something extraordinary happened. During a naval battle off the coast of Valencia, Piri and his uncle captured a Spanish sailor who claimed he had sailed with Christopher Columbus on one of his voyages to the New World. Let that sink in. A crew member who had personally crossed the Atlantic with Columbus, captured by Ottoman pirates in the Mediterranean, and this man was carrying a map. Not just any map. According to Piri himself, who wrote about this directly on the face of his own map years later, this Spanish prisoner possessed a chart of the western lands drawn by Columbus during his voyages. The maps Columbus made during those trips to the Americas have been lost. They are gone. Historians have searched for them for centuries and never found them. But if Piri Reis is telling the truth, and there is very strong evidence that he is, then his 1513 map contains a copy of one of the most important lost documents in the history of exploration. Kemal Reis died in 1511 when his ship was destroyed in a Mediterranean storm. Piri was gutted. He temporarily retired from the Navy and returned to Gallipoli, and it was there, in the quiet grief of losing the man who had raised him at sea, that he sat down and began the work that would make him immortal. Using approximately 20 different source maps, he started to build a single comprehensive picture of the known world. 8 of his sources were Ptolemaic maps from the ancient Greek tradition that had been preserved and copied in the Islamic world for centuries. He used 4 Portuguese maps that showed the coastlines around the Indian Ocean. He used an Arabic map of India. And he used that Columbus chart, the one taken from the Spanish prisoner a decade earlier. In 1513, working on a sheet of gazelle skin parchment, he finished his masterpiece. It was a portolan chart, the style used by Mediterranean sailors, built around compass roses and directional lines rather than the latitude and longitude grids we use today. It was covered with over 30 inscriptions in Ottoman Turkish and featured more than 100 place names. And it was, by any standard of its time, a remarkable piece of work. But here is the thing that turned a remarkable map into one of the most controversial objects in history. When Piri finished the map in 1513, he gave it to Sultan Selim I after the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517. The Sultan apparently did nothing with it. The map vanished. For over 400 years, it sat forgotten in the imperial archives. And when scholars finally unrolled it in 1929 and started examining it closely, they noticed something that should not have been possible. The bottom section of the map appeared to depict a continuous coastline stretching south from the tip of South America and curving dramatically to the east. The shapes, the contours, the geographical features, they bore what some researchers would later claim was an unmistakable resemblance to the northern coastline of Antarctica. And Antarctica was not discovered until 1820. No European, no Ottoman, no one from any recorded civilization had laid eyes on that continent until 3 centuries after Piri drew his map. So the question became very simple and very unsettling. How did he know it was there? That question lay mostly dormant until the 1960s, when a college professor in New Hampshire named Charles Hapgood picked up the thread and pulled on it hard enough to set off a firestorm. Hapgood was not a cartographer. He was a history of science teacher at Keene Teachers College, a man who had worked in military intelligence during the Second World War and had a habit of chasing ideas that most of his peers considered fringe. He had already developed a theory about the Earth's crust shifting catastrophically, an idea that even Albert Einstein found intriguing enough to write a foreword for Hapgood's book on the subject. But when Hapgood got his hands on a copy of the Piri Reis map, he became obsessed with one specific question. If the southern landmass on the map really was Antarctica, then whoever originally charted it must have done so before the ice sheet covered the coast. And that would mean the source maps Piri used were not just old, they were ancient beyond anything mainstream history was prepared to accept. Hapgood and his students spent years analyzing the map. They compared its coastlines to modern surveys and studied the projection system Piri used. And then, Hapgood did something that gave his theory a stamp of credibility that still echoes today. He sent his findings to the United States Air Force. Specifically, he contacted the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base and asked them to evaluate whether the southern section of the Piri Reis map could be a depiction of Antarctica. On July 6, 1960, a lieutenant colonel named Harold Z. Ohlmeyer wrote back. The letter stated that the geographical details shown in the lower part of the map agreed remarkably with the results of a seismic survey conducted across the Antarctic ice cap by a joint Scandinavian and British expedition in 1949. It went on to say that this indicated the coastline had been mapped before the ice cap covered it, and that the ice in that region was now about a mile thick. The letter concluded with a line that has been quoted in every article about this map ever since.
It said that they had no idea how the data on the map could be reconciled with the supposed state of geographical knowledge in 1513.
That letter was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Hapgood published his theory in a 1966 book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, arguing that the Piri Reis map was evidence that a sophisticated but unknown civilization had mapped the entire globe thousands of years before recorded history. He proposed that this civilization could determine longitude accurately, something European navigators could not do until the 1760s. He suggested their knowledge had been preserved in the Great Library of Alexandria, and that fragments survived in maps copied over centuries, eventually reaching cartographers like Piri Reis. 2 years later, a Swiss author named Erich von Däniken borrowed Hapgood's arguments for his book Chariots of the Gods. Von Däniken skipped the careful research and simply declared that the map proved ancient astronauts had visited Earth because only beings with aerial technology could have surveyed Antarctica from above. The map went from a cartographic curiosity to a pop culture phenomenon overnight.
But here is where the story gets more complicated, and honestly, more interesting than either the believers or the skeptics want to admit. Real cartographers and historians dug into the map with serious rigor. Gregory Mackintosh, one of the foremost scholars of the Piri Reis map, published an exhaustive study in 2000 examining every claim Hapgood had made. His conclusions were devastating for the Antarctica theory. Mackintosh pointed out that the southern landmass on the map is directly connected to South America, with no gap between them. There is no Drake Passage, the wide body of water that separates South America from Antarctica. If Piri intended to show Antarctica as a separate continent, why would he draw it attached to South America? Mackintosh argued that the map actually shows a conventional depiction of Terra Australis, the hypothetical southern continent that European mapmakers had been drawing since the time of Ptolemy. Many maps from the 1500s included a giant southern landmass. It was standard practice. Piri was not showing Antarctica, he was showing an idea.
Other scholars piled on. Cartographic historian Svat Soucek noted that the parchment curves slightly near the bottom, and that it was common for cartographers to bend coastlines to fit the available surface. The unusual eastward sweep that Hapgood interpreted as Queen Maud Land could simply be the coast of southern Brazil, distorted to follow the edge of the gazelle skin. Diego Cuoghi, an Italian researcher who conducted his own analysis, pointed out that Portuguese cartographers had strong political reasons to show the South American coast bending east. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 had divided the New World between Spain and Portugal, and pushing the coastline eastward on a map would make it appear that more territory fell within the Portuguese zone. It was not ancient mystery, it was geopolitics. The southernmost point depicted on contemporary Portuguese maps was the Brazilian coast near Cananea, at about 25 degrees south. Beyond that, the coast was unknown, and mapmakers filled in the blanks with educated guesses and inherited tradition.
So does that mean the map is debunked? Case closed, nothing to see here? Not even close. Because even if you strip away the Antarctica theory entirely, the Piri Reis map is still one of the most astonishing documents to survive from the Age of Discovery. And the things it actually does show, the things that are verified and undeniable, are in many ways more impressive than the fringe theories. Start with South America. In 1513, Europeans had known about the existence of the American continents for barely 2 decades. Most maps from that era show the New World as a vague, misshapen blob. But the Piri Reis map depicts the eastern coastline of Brazil with a level of detail and accuracy that scholars have called remarkable for its time. Rivers, bays, coastal features, they are all there, placed in positions that correspond surprisingly well with modern maps. The question is not whether Piri had access to ancient alien technology. The question is how an Ottoman admiral in Constantinople managed to compile a more accurate picture of South America. The answer lies in something that is often overlooked when people talk about this map: The Ottoman Empire was not some isolated backwater. It was one of the most powerful and well-connected civilizations on Earth. Istanbul sat at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Ottoman merchants, diplomats, and spies moved through every major port in the known world. The Imperial Library in Constantinople contained documents that traced back through centuries of Islamic scholarship, Greek philosophy, and Persian science. When Piri Reis said he compiled his map from 20 different sources, he was not exaggerating. He had access to a network of information that most European kings could only dream of. The Portuguese were obsessively secretive about their maps. The Spanish treated navigational charts as state secrets. But the Ottomans had captured Portuguese sailors, interrogated Spanish prisoners, traded with Arab merchants who sailed the Indian Ocean, and inherited scholarly traditions that preserved ancient Greek cartography in ways that Western Europe had long forgotten.
And then there is the Columbus connection, which is genuinely one of the most important aspects of this map that often gets buried under all the Antarctica noise. Piri Reis explicitly states on the map itself that he used a chart drawn by Columbus showing the western lands. Scholars who have analyzed the Caribbean section of the map have found compelling evidence that this is true. The way Hispaniola is depicted on the Piri Reis map matches the shape and orientation of Cipango, Marco Polo's name for Japan, which is exactly what Columbus believed Hispaniola was. Columbus thought he had reached Asia. He believed Cuba was a peninsula of the Asian mainland, and that is precisely how these places appear on the Piri Reis map. The island labeled as Hispaniola even carries the place name Navidad, the name of the very first European settlement in the New World, a detail found on almost no other map from this period. The Turkish rendering of these Spanish place names, the specific geographical errors that match Columbus's known misconceptions, the crude rendering of islands that were barely explored at the time, all of this points to one conclusion. Piri Reis had access to a map that either came directly from Columbus or was closely copied from one. That means this gazelle skin parchment sitting in a palace in Istanbul is the closest thing we have to seeing the world through Columbus's own eyes.
Think about what that means for a second. Every map Columbus drew on his voyages to the Americas is gone, destroyed, lost, or simply vanished from history. But a Turkish pirate turned admiral, working from a captured chart in a workshop in Gallipoli, preserved a piece of that lost knowledge. The Piri Reis map is not just a map, it is a time capsule. It captured a specific moment in history when the world was being redrawn in real time, when every voyage across the Atlantic brought back information that overturned everything people thought they knew about the shape of the planet. And Piri Reis, sitting at the intersection of East and West, had a front row seat to all of it.
But the story of the man behind the map does not end there, and honestly, his ending is the part that sticks with you the longest. After completing his map in 1513 and presenting it to the Sultan, Piri Reis went back to the navy. He fought in the Ottoman conquest of Egypt. He participated in the siege of Rhodes in 1522. He continued his cartographic work, producing a massive navigational atlas called the Kitabi Bahriye, the Book of the Sea, which contained over 200 detailed charts of Mediterranean ports, coastlines, and harbors. It was one of the most comprehensive navigational guides of its era. In 1528, he completed a second world map, though only a small fragment survives. By the 1540s, Piri Reis was an old man, approaching 80, and he had been promoted to commander of the Ottoman fleet in the Indian Ocean.
In 1548, he was sent to recapture the port of Aden from forces that had been courting Portuguese protection. He succeeded. It was a brilliant victory for a man his age. But the success earned him an even bigger mission. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent ordered him to take the Portuguese-controlled island of Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. This was the assignment that would destroy him. Piri sailed his fleet east, but instead of going straight to Basra to pick up 15,000 soldiers as ordered, he attacked the Portuguese-held city of Muscat along the way. He captured it, but the detour cost him the element of surprise. When he finally reached Hormuz and laid siege to the fortress, the Portuguese garrison was ready.
They had supplies, heavy artillery, and thick walls. Piri could not break through. Weeks passed. His ammunition ran low.
And then word came that a massive Portuguese relief fleet was heading his way. Piri Reis made a decision that would cost him everything. He abandoned the siege.
He retreated to Basra, but the Ottoman governor there, a man named Kubad Pasha, refused to help him. The two men despised each other. Kubad denied Piri the rowers he needed for his galleys, and almost certainly sent accusatory reports back to the capital. Piri left most of his fleet behind and sailed back to Egypt with only 2 or 3 ships, loaded with treasure accumulated over decades of service. That treasure became the nail in his coffin. When he arrived in Egypt, he was arrested on the Sultan's orders. The charges were lifting the siege without permission, abandoning his fleet, and looting. Some Ottoman historians recorded allegations that he had been bribed by the Portuguese, though most modern scholars consider that unlikely. An Ottoman historian of the period later wrote that the bribery charge was implausible, but the Sultan chose to believe it anyway. No real investigation was conducted. The order came down from Suleiman himself. Piri Reis, the greatest cartographer the Ottoman Empire ever produced, was taken to Cairo and beheaded. He was nearly 90 years old. It is one of the cruelest endings in the history of exploration. A man who spent his entire life charting the unknown, who preserved knowledge that would have otherwise been lost forever, was executed on charges that even his contemporaries found suspicious. His treasure was confiscated. His fleet was left behind in Basra, where the Portuguese eventually destroyed it. And his maps, the work that actually mattered, were rolled up and forgotten in a palace library for over 400 years.
But here is what makes this story worth telling. The map survived. That is the part that gets me. Everything else was taken from Piri Reis. His command, his reputation, his life. But the one thing that the Sultan and the governors and the accusers could not touch was the knowledge he put onto that piece of gazelle skin. And in 1929, when scholars finally unrolled it again, they did not just find an old map. They found proof that the early 16th century was far more interconnected and far more sophisticated than our history books usually suggest. The Piri Reis map shows us that an Ottoman admiral in Constantinople could piece together a more complete picture of the globe than almost any European monarch of his time. It shows us that the line between pirate and scholar was thinner than we might think. It shows us that knowledge does not care about empires or borders. It travels on captured ships and stolen charts,
and whispered conversations between a prisoner and his captors. Whether the map shows Antarctica or not, and the honest answer is that it almost certainly does not, that is not what makes it extraordinary. What makes it extraordinary is that it exists at all. A pirate's nephew, grieving his uncle in a small port town, sat down and drew the entire known world on a piece of animal skin. And 500 years later, we are still talking about it. That is the kind of legacy that no sultan can take away.
Today, the Piri Reis map is recognized by UNESCO as a memory of the world document. It sits in the archives of the Topkapi Palace, brought out only occasionally for exhibition, because light, heat, and humidity threaten to destroy the fragile gazelle skin. When it is displayed, visitors line up through the palace courtyards. People come from all over the world to stand in front of a 500-year-old piece of parchment and stare at the same coastlines and compass roses that Piri drew in 1513. Some come because they believe it proves something about ancient civilizations. Some come because they appreciate the technical skill. But most of them, I think, come because they sense what I sense when I look at this map, that it represents something bigger than itself. It is a record of a moment when humanity was redrawing the boundaries of the known world, and one man, a pirate turned admiral turned scholar, tried to capture all of it on a single piece of skin.
He did not get everything right. No one could have. But he tried. And the fact that his work outlasted his empire, outlasted the men who killed him, outlasted every single one of the 20 source maps he used to create it, that tells you something about the power of knowledge. They can take everything from you, but they cannot take what you put on the map.